In today's lecture, we are going to discuss about the pleasures of tragedy as Aristotle discussed in Poetics. As we have seen yesterday, that in the introduction of chapter number 14, Aristotle says that tragic poets should not seek every pleasure from tragedy, but the one that is characteristic of it. And then he continues that the poet should produce the pleasure which comes from pity and fear and should do by means of imitation. The stress on characteristic pleasure of tragedy, and we have seen yesterday that tragedy has two functions. First, it serves to distinguish what is appropriate to tragedy from what is appropriate to other forms of poetry. And you come to a conclusion that best kind of plot in what he discusses in chapter number 13, with a happy ending for good characters gives pleasure more akin to the characteristics of pleasure of comedy. And secondly, it distinguishes the characteristically tragic pleasure from other pleasures which tragedy arouses, which are not distinctively to it. And therefore, after discussing these two different functions of tragedy, we come to a conclusion that Aristotle's analysis is what tragedy offers to its audience is complex and multi-layered. You cannot say that what audience get out of tragedy is only catharsis or only evocation of pity and fear. It is multi-layered, it is complex. So you cannot jump to one particular conclusion directly that yes, this is what is happening is this one. Now we start to on relatively firm ground. In the definition of tragedy, at the beginning of chapter number 6, Aristotle says that tragedy is composed in a language made pleasurable, which is explained as speech, which is carrying rhythm, and in some parts it is carrying melody. The fact that tragedy is written in verse and that part of it is sung by chorus. This gives us pleasure. Not the whole tragedy is sung. Not the whole tragedy carries the lyrical language. Not the whole tragedy carries a sort of melody in it. It has got a rhythm. It is continuously carrying a rhythm within itself. It is not that it is not carrying a rhythm. But there are melodies somewhere in between. In some parts there are melodies, and those melodies sung by chorus gives a sort of pleasure to the audience. Now this is consistent with the sort of observation we have seen, we have studied in, or we have discussed in chapter number 4. If you see very carefully, my friends, or if you remember something of chapter number 4 that we discussed quite before, quite early in the series of lectures that we are running through, that Aristotle has mentioned that rhythm and melody are natural to human instincts. As we have also discussed the same thing, that when you speak in rhythm, when you speak in melody, we are quite alert. We become quite alert and we start to imitate it. And that's why when a kid starts speaking, the language used to teach, to train the kid is rhythmical. Not the most complex words are used which are in pronunciation, the most complex pronunciation. We use very simple pronunciation that makes the kid to get trained with the sort of language he has to speak. And that is what Aristotle said in chapter number 4. He said rhythm and melody are natural to human beings. Well, Aristotle says that these are the natural to human beings. Natural things are always pleasurable. That is what Aristotle is trying to point out. Whatever things are there, the things can become pleasurable if those are natural. Similarly, you will find out, my friends, that Aristotle, even at the end of chapter number 6, he pointed out that song is described as the most important of the sources of pleasure. Now, we experience these things in our routine life, we experience this thing in our day to day life, that songs are the most important source of pleasure for us. And the pleasure is to be derived from music. How it is to be derived from music, how the music gives pleasure, all these things Aristotle discussed in chapter number 26. And this music, which is part of tragedy, Aristotle pointed out in chapter number 26 that this makes tragedy superior than epic, because music gives more pleasure. People feel close because of the music. Now, the same passage which speaks about music, which is identified as one of the things which gives pleasure to the audience in tragedy. And somehow this point is quite, can say, is not clarified very well, that whether that was written by Aristotle or not. We don't know exactly that who wrote this particular point. It is not clear. But the same passage probably identifies spectacle as an additional source of pleasure also. So there is pleasure which is to be got from both the verbal text of tragedy and from its visual and oral realization. That means what is seen on the stage and heard when the play is performed. But these pleasures of the verbal text and performance are not distinctive to tragedy. They are not distinctive to tragedy. Because you cannot say that, okay, this is only in tragedy. No, the performance and the verbal text are also part of comedy. So these are not exclusive things that tragedy carries. It is part of any drama that is being performed. And we have already seen that Aristotle rates lyric poetry and spectacle as the least important parts of tragedy. That's why spectacle appears in the sixth constituent of tragedy, and lyrics appeared as fourth constituent of tragedy. That means they are least important in the complete list of constituents of tragedy. Now, another pleasure is implied by the discussion of poetry as imitation at the beginning of chapter number 4. Aristotle observes that imitation is naturally pleasurable. It is very much giving pleasure to human beings. And he also explains this with reference to the process of recognition which it involves. It is not simply because of the poetry or the imitations that are part of poetry. Poetry imitates so many things, drama imitates so many things in it. But when it imitates so many things within, you're not going to get pleasure because you're watching something which has been imitated in front of you. But what sort of imitation is going on in front of you? If you can able to recognize that imitation, yes, this is what is in the that is what is imitated into this poetry. This recognition gives a sort of pleasure. If you don't recognize it, you will not able to get pleasure of it. When we, for example, when we look at the picture of Socrates, and we have to identify, if I put 3 4 pictures in front of you, and if those 3 4 pictures that is kept in front of you of different persons, and I said please identify Socrates out of it, or please identify Sophocles out of it. And when you are trying to identify Sophocles or Socrates out of those 4 5 pictures, What you are doing when you are identifying that particular character, when you are identifying that particular picture, that who is Socrates or who is Sophocles out of these four pictures, the process which we are following is we are simply exercising our capacity to learn and understand, because somewhere you have seen the portrait of Socrates or Sophocles where you have learned and understand that this kind of picture is of Socrates. Now remember, when we are saying this, again we are somehow going back to the point which was made by Plato also, that when a poet writes, imitates certain things, that imitation is thrice away from reality. It is not real. Similarly, when you watch a portrait, you have studied, you have seen somewhere. It is somehow kept in your subconscious, and you try to recognize it. You give pressure to recognize it, and you try to exercise your own capacity. And after watching that picture, when first time somebody gives you a picture of Socrates to you and said that, look, this is the picture of Socrates, please look at it, what you did, you recognize it, you keep the things very perfectly in your mind, and you started to recognize and realize that yes, this is how Socrates looks like. Then second time when it comes in front of you, you started to recognize Socrates with your capacity of learn and understanding that yes, I learned this thing somewhere before, I understood this particular thing. Now this learning and understanding of that particular portrait, learning and understanding of that particular imitation gives you pleasure. This learning, this understanding, the process which you exercise, we exercise our capacity, we exercise the process with our own capacity to learn and understand it. And that is what Aristotle calls it as a pleasure. When you watch something which has been imitated in front of you on the stage, and you understand that what is imitated on the stage, you recognize it, you get a pleasure out of it. Now, if a tragedy is an imitation, then in watching and responding to a tragedy, we surely follow the similar process of understanding and recognizing it. If you understand this thing very carefully, my friends, that whenever we watch any tragedy, if I say it in a modern or today's concept, you have seen in various situations. When you watch a film, you start somehow tears coming out of your eyes because of certain situations, certain scene that is reflected on the screen, because we are less watching dramas live on the stage. We are watching films more than dramas. That's why I'm giving this example. Aristotle has not given this example. Please remember. Now, this coming tears coming out of your eyes are not simply because you are facing certain problem because of that. Your mind recognized that situation and compares it immediately, understands it that this somehow can happen or would have happened or somehow will take place in future, probably. And that's why it responds immediately. It responds with a sort of tears coming out of your eyes. because you recognize that particular situation, you recognize that particular uh, thing that is imitated in front of you. Only evoking of pity and fear for purification by the sort of discussion that we yesterday took is also requiring the other side of the coin also. As yesterday we discussed of the one side of coin, that how poet can develop a situation to evoke pity and fear. And that's why yesterday I have given you an example that the modern critic Augusto Boal said that audiences are oppressed always because they don't have any chance to speak, they don't have any chance to say, although they know the fact that this is what is happening, this is what will happen, they are not allowed to speak. Yesterday we talked of that particular side of coin. Now today we are talking of other side of coin. Now, okay, the situation, the characters are simply showing you all these sorts of emotions which evoke the pity and fear amongst the audience. But if those things are not being recognized by audience, then what will happen? Aristotle is pointing out this particular case also here. Now, when you are when we are saying, according to Aristotle, that we have to exercise our capacity of recognizing, and if we recognize and understand, and then we can able to get pleasure out of it. Pleasure is not simply getting after looking at the things simply. We'll get pleasure after recognizing and understanding that particular thing, then we are going to get enjoy the pleasure of that particular poem, that particular drama. That means the other side is that your capacity of understanding and recognition need to be very strong. Now if I connect to the situation with yesterday's talk, that characters need to be present in such a way that they should give, they should evoke the emotions amongst the audience. But if audience are not recognizing and not exercising their power of recognition and understanding, then how it is going to take place? It will not take place. That's why getting pleasure in tragedy requires both sides to work with a coordination. If on one side the things are well made, perfect, properly fined, on the other side the capacity of recognition and understanding is also important on the part of the audience. Also, if the audience is not able to recognize or they are not exercising their capacity of recognition and understanding, then the whole purpose of giving pleasure of tragedy will not take place. And that's why when you in future, if you are interested in studying certain different things altogether comparatively, you will find out in comparison, if you try to compare it with the very famous treatise on drama written by Bharat Muni in India, Natya Shastra. Bharat Muni's Natya Shastra used to say that the audience should be learned one. They should be learned one. That is what the condition of the audience. That Bharat Muni has mentioned in Natya Shastra as compared to the Indian dramaturgy. When I am when we are looking at the Western dramaturgy and we are looking at the theory propounded by Aristotle in regard to the performances of drama, then we can able to even put the things together on the same platform that when Indian dramaturgy is talking about the learned audience, similarly Aristotle is also expecting that the audience should have that much capacity within themselves. Most of the times what happens, the audiences are not able to, if they are not able to exercise their capacity of recognition and understanding, how it is going to suffice the aim of tragedy, how it is going to reach to the objective that tragedy has defined, evocation of emotions, catharsis. Because catharsis is not a process of the audience of the other side of the stage. Catharsis is not meant for the characters of the drama. Catharsis is not made for the people on the stage. Catharsis is expected from the people of the stage who are watching it. So catharsis is not a process of the whole complete audiences and including the whole people or whole human beings watching that. No, catharsis is only for the audiences, not for the actors who are performing that particular character, not for the chorus who is singing the songs there. Chorus will sing the song, but the pleasure is not to be gained by the chorus. They will get a pleasure that they sung very well. But the sort of lyric and the sort of rhythm and the sort of the melody they carried out through their song will give pleasure to the audience. So that is made simply for the sake of audience. The objective is audience, and that's why Aristotle is saying that exercise the capacity of recognition and understanding. If the audience is able to exercise the capacity of recognition and understanding, then and then it is possible that the pleasure out of the tragedy can be gained. Now, in the light of Aristotle's analysis of plot, we can see that the process involved in watching a tragedy is somewhat more complex than that involved in recognizing and understanding the picture of Socrates, that is the painting. The process of recognition in tragedy is very complex one. It is not so simple. Because when you are watching a performance in front of your eyes, when you are watching the things that the actors are presenting in front of you, now what is the responsibility of the audience? That this audience need to be that this audience has to focus on various aspects of tragedy. It is not so simple that okay, watching a portrait makes you to understand that okay, this is what the beard is, this is what the hairstyle is, this is what the face and nose and eyes and all this face is made up of this particular shape is of Socrates. You can use your recognition and capacity of recognition and understanding. You can exercise this capacity in this sense, in this way, to recognize any painting. But when you are recognizing, when you are trying to exercise your capacity of recognition and understanding in the case of tragedy, you have to follow the plot. And plot is not very simple thing to understand. Plot is not simply you are narrating a story in one line and saying that, okay, enjoy it. No, plot is not like that. As we know it very well, that plot is a connected series and sequences and consequences of different sorts of action. There are actions and reflections. Now you have to follow the plot, which means you are recognizing the connecting events together. If you miss any of the connecting events, you will not able to understand what exactly it is going on, and then you cannot able to get derive pleasure out of it. And that is why understanding tragedy is a complex process. Somehow I can move ahead and say that okay, it is possible for you if I say it is a complex process in understanding tragedy or understanding drama, but later on we can say in modern phase or in 18th, 17th, 18th century when novel appears in front of us, novel becomes more complex to understand because here you are at least watching something going on in front of your eyes, but in novel you have to imagine everything and you have to remember the relations of one character with each other, how when this character appeared in between what page, and that makes you a little bit more complex to understand the whole process, the whole thing together. So you are not recognizing only plot, you are recognizing the connecting events and sequences of it, and recognizing this sequence in a very stipulated, in a very demarcated pattern. You are not allowed to get out of this particular pattern. It is designed by the poet, and that's why if I make it a little bit easy to you to understand by giving an example of the film, that when you are watching a film, you are not simply watching the film what you want to watch, you are watching the films from the perception of the camera. The camera is moving as per the ideas narrated by the story, and the camera is moving as per the directions approach of looking at that particular thing. So you are looking at a particular frame. You are not allowed to look out of this particular frame. Similar thing happens in drama also. You are not allowed to look at the things which are not outside of the frame. You are not watching the things off the stage. You have to watch the things which are on the stage. That's why your recognition is required to have that much capacity to understand the connected sequence which are coming appearing in front of you in a very demarcated pattern. It is not coming simply haphazardly in front of you that okay, this is what happened, this is what happened, this is what happened, enjoy. No, you cannot do like that. It has got its own pattern and you have to recognize this pattern. And that's why, my friends, remember one thing, every playwright has developed his own pattern, and that's why we say that it is Shakespearean drama, it is Marlowean drama, it is Greek drama, because there is a particular pattern and we have to recognize this particular pattern of sequences. Sometimes some patterns are universal patterns. It is not defined, it is not designed, it is not demarcated by the poet or dramatist. Some patterns are universal patterns. So you have to recognize those universal patterns also. That is that some events, some events are even coming in, you can say, uh, in the form of even you can say, my friends, that it will come in the form of uh, I think I'll take a little bit of time to make it because the power is failed right now at my house, so I'm trying to develop a Wi-Fi hotspot, and I'm continuing it. It will take a little bit of moment. You will find that when I'm shifting it to it. Yes, I think. Am I connected once again? Hello. So we have to understand that there are certain universal patterns also, and in these universal patterns, the events are connected in accordance with necessity or probability. The events are somehow carrying the idea of necessity and probability that we have discussed in chapter number 7, 8. But this is not unduly demanding, my friends. And the process will still, therefore, be inherently pleasurable because certain patterns are universal patterns, because most of the times the dramatists try to include most of the times the universal patterns rather than putting the patterns demarcated by himself. Some of the signatures he will put at certain places, but will not carry the same thing throughout the tragedy. And that is why it is very much interesting to understand that, because the universal patterns with understanding of necessity and probability are part of our own understanding, that inherently used to give pleasure to us. And that's why this sort of complex process that I narrated to you, I explained to you, will automatically takes place with the audience. It has not to make any specific efforts to find out. And that's why we start to like that particular tragedy. Now this cognitive pleasure is not distinctive to tragedy, because the same sort of process, this is not distinctive to tragedy. As I said you earlier also, that when we are talking of all those things, we have to understand another aspect of it, that this is not only related with tragedy, because when you are watching a performance, when you are watching a thing going on in front of your eyes, it is not related with tragedy. A comedy can also have the same thing. So the cognitive pleasure, that you recognize it, you understand it, this cognitive pleasure is not distinctive to tragedy also. The same process of recognition, the same process of understanding, the same process of connecting the sequences and events in understanding the plot of that particular drama imitated on the stage is also part of comedy also. That means cognitive pleasure does not bring the fear, does not bring or does not come from pity and fear. Pity and fear never, they are never related, or they are never restricted themselves to cognitive pleasure. If the cognitive pleasure can be derived in comedy, then how will you say that this cognitive pleasure is the only and is the source for evocation of the emotions? Because it is neutral. When you are talking of cognitive pleasure is neutral. It is not that it is related with only one part of the thing and not related with other part of the things. No. The cognitive pleasure, we can say, like the pleasures of text and performance, a pleasure derived from tragedy, it is not distinctive and characteristic pleasure. The cognitive pleasure is simply coming out of the text and the performance. Whatever text it may be, whatever sort of performance it may be, it is not distinctive feature of tragedy only. Please remember this. It is very simple. That means audience's response is most important. And we can even move further and discuss and point out the fact that those performances, those texts which are carrying more universal patterns are more close to the audiences in giving pleasure to them. That's why you will find out the Greek tragedies, either Greek tragedies or Shakespearean tragedies, they are more close to the audience than rest of the tragedies written in that particular period. We have seen in our last semester that Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare both are contemporaries, but why? What makes Shakespeare to become more close to the world than Marlowe? Why people or why the artists are still crazy to perform Shakespeare today? Because if the text carries more universal patterns in it, then it will give a chance to it to remain alive for a long time. Universal patterns. And that is how you will find out, my friends, that universal patterns are always trying to develop the sense of cognitive pleasure amongst the audience. Now, if you are talking about the distinctive pleasure and pleasures of tragedy, then what exactly should be the distinctive feature of tragedy then? If cognitive pleasure is not the distinctive feature of tragedy, it is a distinctive feature of the performance, whether it is tragedy or comedy, or else you can say tragicomedy, any sort of performance that is going in front of your eyes. The next step globally